Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the IWF Book Club. Today, we're going to be discussing, this is our monthly book, is by Mollie Hemingway. And I'm thrilled that Mollie is going to be joining us in just a second. And I'm sure that most of you already know a lot about Mollie Hemingway. But just as by background, she's the editor-in-chief of the online magazine, The Federalist, and a contributor for Fox News. She's co-author of the best-selling Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Supreme Court, along with Carrie Saravino. And the book we're discussing today, here it is called Rigged: How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. That was published just late last year. Now, before we invite Mollie on stage, I'm going to toss it over to Julie Gunlock. Julie is going to explain how the virtual platform we are using today works.
Hey everyone, I'm so excited about this book club. I'm such a huge fan of Mollie's, and I read all of her books. So this is going to be a lot of fun. But again, as Carrie mentioned, before we get into this, I want to go over some technical stuff. They give me all the fun stuff to do. So we want you to ask a question. We want you to get into the chat room, and we certainly want you all to take our polls. So let me explain how this works. We do have a chat room on the right-hand side of your screen where you can join the discussion with other attendees and with my IWF colleagues who have the word team next to their names. If you don't see the chat room, click chat in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Next to the chat room tab, there is a questions tab. If you have a question for Mollie, and this is really important, please post it in the questions tab. I always mess this up. I always end up putting it in the chat tab, but make sure you put it in the questions tab. You can give other attendees questions bumps by hitting the up arrow, and this helps us identify which questions are popular or are interesting. You may have the same question, so instead of asking a similar question, you can just give someone a bump. There are polls as well where one of my colleagues has posted some questions for you to answer, and we really encourage you to take those polls. You can also click the react button at the bottom of the screen to send emoji reaction anytime during the event. Toward the end of our time today, we'll be drawing and announcing names to win 3 copies of the book. In order to win, you must be present during the drawing at the end of today's event. The books will be mailed to our door prize winners. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Carrie.
Great. Well, with the technical stuff out of the way, we're thrilled to have the opportunity to hear from the author herself, Mollie Hemingway. So please join me in welcoming her on stage.
I feel like there should be applause. I'm just going to do it.
I know, exactly. And since, yeah.
Just give it a few minutes.
Hoping Mollie can come. Yeah, no, I'm sure she's just getting on. I hope everybody can see the book here. It's quite a thick book. I didn't expect when I got it. I was thinking I didn't have any sense of it, and I'm impressed with just there's so much information in here. I don't know if everybody else got the chance to read it, but it's a really, just like Mollie's other books have all been, they've been like incredibly footnoted, sourced, and I think that's a real important fact about this book is just how serious it is and weighty. So, hey, Mollie, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here with you. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah. Well, I really want to, jump right in here. Mollie, I think when people hear about this, the book Rigged and the topic, I think that people automatically start thinking of some of what has been called in the media or really demeaned in the media as the quote big lie. You talk about this a bit at the end of your book, just how the smearing of any attempt to talk about the election and some of the improprieties that went on in it. So I wanted to kind of open that up first, is if you can talk about why it was important to write this book almost as something that says like, yes, this is a legitimate topic for discussion.
Well, I think it's kind of worth also just going back a few years. I have been doing a lot of journalism in the last few years, including from 2016 through 2020, when the most important patriotic thing you could do, supposedly, was to question the results of the 2016 election. It was not treated as a fringe thing. It was not treated as a threat to the republic, even though it was. It was actually done by everybody. I mean, Hillary Clinton said that the election was stolen from her. Jimmy Carter said that Trump didn't win. The Russians stole the election on his behalf, or that the Russians won it. Everyone in the media claimed this, and didn't just claim it as a one-off for a few months. They went for this for years. It caused massive problems. And to this day, a majority of Democrats actually believe in this kind of crazy conspiracy theory that Russians stole the 2016 election, and that's how Trump won. So then we get to 2020, which is, everyone knows, the weirdest election we have ever experienced. And all of a sudden, you weren't allowed to ask any questions. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm one of those people who is frequently debunking conspiracy theories. And I found these twin conspiracy theories. You heard the one about Venezuela controlling voter machines or whatever. That is a conspiracy theory. The much more dominant one is that there was nothing wrong with the 2020 election. And that's the one that we all know isn't true, because we experienced what the media did. We experienced what tech companies did. We saw that there were hundreds of changes to laws and processes, that those weren't always constitutionally done. And we also have learned a lot about the private takeover of government election offices through Zuckerberg funding. I mean, these are all things that need to be discussed, because you want to have free and fair elections that people trust. And the idea that you couldn't talk about it just bothered me. So I knew I had to research and report it myself. And that's what the book is.
Yeah. Before I let Julie jump in, I want to, it's interesting, because I do think that I love how in the book you unpack that we really need to, when we think about how the rigging of the election happened, that there's kind of the day of, or the actual ballot casting and the ballot counting, which is what we kind of all think of. But then there's also everything that happens before and after. I think in your book, you have a good example of you can't just focus on the verdict of a trial to know if the trial was fair. That's one important part of it. But there's everything that goes into it from the moment the trial begins till the verdict is reached, and that voting's kind of the same way. So I want to dig in later, but if you mentioned a couple of the aspects, but can you talk a little bit about all of the other things outside of that, kind of like the actual voting that you see as a part of kind of what made this election rigged?
Well, that's exactly right. And I think people frequently were focusing just on election day or the counting of votes, when they should have been thinking about everything that led up to the election day, which is really election year or election season, and all of the ways in which we had changed the way we vote to make it very difficult to detect problems. And so you think about things like what your voting lists are like, whether they are clean or whether they're full of a lot of, so actually, let me take another step back. When you move from in-person voting to mail-in balloting, it increases opportunities for fraud. That doesn't mean that fraud necessarily exists with a particular mail-in balloting situation. It just increases opportunities. And here are some other things that increase opportunities. Having messy voter lists. Tons of Americans move every single year. They frequently move from one state to the next, yet their name stays on voting rolls. Corrupt people can take advantage of that, because it's very difficult to do anything if someone were to take advantage of a name being on a voter roll who doesn't actually live there, get someone to vote in that name. When you go to vote in person, it decreases opportunities to manipulate whether you're really the person or not. When you're just mailing ballots out willy-nilly to anybody who's on a voter roll, and that does happen in several states, or you're letting third parties apply for ballots so that they can still be sent to a place, and then you aren't actually overseeing any part of the voting process. You don't know if there's coercion, if there's threatening. I mean, one of the things that I found interesting while researching the book is that voting has changed a lot over the course of our country's history. It used to be that you would go in person, like in front of a judge, and cast your vote. And then people realized that was really ripe for corruption, because someone could say, if you vote for me, I'll let you slide on that $5 you owe me. And so they moved slowly into one day of voting in a particular place with one ballot given, administered by the government and given to a person rather than ballots coming in from the outside, all to decrease corruption. And the more you move away from that, the more you go back to increasing opportunities for corruption or coercion, including one of the big issues that happened in 2020 were that people who really shouldn't have been voting because they have lost the capacity to make decisions, they were seeing ballots come in under their name. That shows the kind of problems that can happen in nursing homes or other situations like that.
Mollie, this book really helped me understand sort of how the breadth of this problem and how many institutions are involved in this. It's actually kind of frightening. And I think later I want to talk a lot about the Zuckerberg instances, but can you talk a little bit, and you've already kind of covered this, but on the, actually casting a ballot, what were the laws that were actually changed in anticipation of the 2020 election? Again, I know this is stuff we're not supposed to talk about, but I'd really like you to cover that part of your book, which again is, it was written so well. I will tell you, I'm sorry, I know there is a question at the end of this, but it was a little bit like reading a thriller. It was, as you unpacked this really huge conspiracy, really, of all of these different institutions that are involved in this.
Yeah. So thank you, first of all, but while I was writing the book, Time Magazine actually kind of admitted the whole conspiracy. They put out an article that said, literally, there was a cabal of powerful people across multiple industries that conspired to control the outcome. And they said, it's not rigging, it was fortification. It was like, that's what we call rigging. It's okay. You can admit that's what happened.
You can say that.
But they were calling it a cabal and a conspiracy, and I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, so part of the operation was to flood. So it's actually the Democratic campaign, the Democratic Party's strategy to flood the zone with tens of millions of mail-in ballots, which are by definition more able to be corrupted and less able to be scrutinized. And so in order to make that happen, they got a big gift from the pandemic gods of COVID-19, enabling them to push through all sorts of things they'd actually been going for a very long time. But it ended up being literally hundreds of changes to laws and processes governing how we vote. And you said, Julie, you're not supposed to talk about it, but in fact, you have to know what the laws and processes are where you live. It is your duty as a citizen of a free country to know and trust these processes. So we all need to know, because they actually do vary by state and even by municipality. So that's like step one, if you care about this issue, is learn what the laws are in your state and learn if they should be truly fortified. But also there's an issue of the Constitution, and this becomes an issue later on as things start breaking down, which is state legislatures are constitutionally the entity that are supposed to handle state election processes and laws. And in many cases, actually, these changes were pushed through the state legislature, but in many more cases, they weren't. And that is a serious constitutional problem and one that can't be ignored. But the whole overarching idea was flood the zone with tens of millions of mail-in ballots. And just think about what that means. It's much more difficult to scrutinize, much less scrutinize properly, a mail-in ballot when you're getting tens of millions and they're all coming in, right there by definition on election day. It is impossible to do any meaningful oversight. But once you separate a ballot from the outer envelope that it's in, you're done. There's nothing really you can do. Right. Yeah. This is not good. Right now, this is an issue that Republicans are very concerned about because they know this happened in order to achieve a particular outcome. But it's actually something people of all parties should care about.
Mollie, you talked a little bit about how the way that the media has made it kind of off limits to talk about election fraud as an issue or the concerns about the election. But obviously, the media had played a role in this. You go back all the way to 2016 about how, with the Russiagate, or this attempt to kind of undermine the legitimacy of the Trump administration. But can you talk a little bit about, I feel like when everybody knows the media is biased, and that's kind of old news that the media is mean to conservatives, but it was completely almost on a different scale during this election, from the choice of stories, coverage of things like COVID. You talk about all this. If you can just give us some of the highlights, and then how new media, what role they played, because I feel like that's one of the biggest overhanging and something we've got to grapple with as we face the future and think of how our country moves forward.
Yeah. So before the election, I was so concerned about media malpractice that I was beginning to use the word rigged to describe what they were doing to the election. And again, you think back to 2016, where we had years of hysteria, all based on this idea that because Russia, which is a bad actor, always a bad actor, like in every election we have, had spent $100,000 on Facebook ads, some for Hillary Clinton, some for Donald Trump. This was like the end of the republic that they had done this. Well, how much worse is what we were experiencing from our own corrupt media? And you're right. People have, literally, it goes back to Dwight Eisenhower complaining about bias in the media when it comes to Republican presidents. George H.W. Bush, his favorite campaign sticker was annoy the media, re-elect Bush. These are longstanding problems. But what we've experienced in the last 5 years is completely different. It's not just the typical bias that you see against conservatives or Republicans. It was outright propaganda, and it was daily propaganda. It was being willing vassals of intelligence services to spread disinformation or misinformation, such as the Russian bounty story, which totally blew up. And some of us were trying to point this out at the time that it came out, that it was not sourced to particularly confidence-inspiring levels, or the made-up story at the Atlantic, which was that Donald Trump had disparaged soldiers. It was based on 4 anonymous sources, supposedly. Yep. It was debunked by even people who hated Donald Trump. Like John Bolton would go out there and be like, I hate this guy. I talk crap about him all the time. He didn't do this. There were contemporaneous weather reports that debunked this. And yet still it got cycled, not just through the Atlantic, but through a bunch of other corrupt media as well. And it's really effective, but it was really years of that going into the election. And then on election year, it was COVID hysteria, which when you think about, you look back on this, you can say that it hit the whole world by surprise. But when it comes to like big picture stuff, including a fast tracking development of vaccines and other therapies, there was good stuff happening, but you didn't see a rally around the flag like the media now say you're supposed to do for other situations. You just saw an endless barrage and assault. And then I think it's also worthy to remember the riots that hit the entire country. This idea that they were provoking racial unrest and a destruction of many cities, sort of in a lose-lose scenario. Like Donald Trump is so bad that he can't control the cities, but also we're not going to let him do anything to control the cities. These were all very effective media-led operations.
Mollie, I just want to, you mentioned the media hostility and being willing to be vassals of, the anti-Trump forces, but it was also coordination. There was actual coordination that I think that we've now seen. And there's now that this has been revealed, there's never an apology. There's never any walking back. There's never any corrections. In fact, they still throw around these ideas. And, I think that's something that is sort of hard for me to accept. And, what do you say about that? That there's never even a price to pay for reporters who have reported false information and then never have to sort of make good or retract that.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that is okay. So we didn't even talk about the worst story of all, which is the most important story of the 2020 election, was the Hunter Biden laptop story, which wasn't really about Hunter Biden or a laptop so much as the Biden family business. And that business is that members of the Biden family take money, regardless of whether they're people you should be giving money to. And with all due respect to Hunter Biden, this is not a person you'd give $5 to, much less millions of dollars to. And yet he was bringing in millions and millions of dollars from corrupt foreign officials throughout the world, people related to the Chinese Communist government. And then what did they get in return? It was kind of never reported on. Obviously, you're giving money to someone because of their access to the people in power in the United States. That means there are policy issues that are being determined that can affect Americans, and yet the media never covered it. And then when someone did cover it, they violently suppressed that story. And just today, I saw I haven't read it yet, but the Washington Post is like, oh, it turns out that laptop is, I guess it's real. Last week or the week before, the New York Times said it too. These are people who won Pulitzers for their lies and participation in the Russia collusion scandal. But now, I assume they want Joe Biden gone. So now they're admitting what many of us were reporting, for the last several years. But on accountability, sorry to keep going on this, I do think it's incumbent upon people who do not want the corrupt media to destroy the country to hold them accountable. And
let me ask you, Carrie, you're probably going to read a question because we've got some good questions coming in. Well,
you go ahead. Yeah.
There are some questions that are coming in now, and I just want to, read a few of them. From Pamela Dunham, she said the media is so complicit, and this really resonates. You know, she asked, like, how do I tell the media that I'm unhappy with this? And then she says, do you ever see the linking of rigged elections from Donald J. Trump? I might be reading that wrong.
Yeah, and if I can reword that, this is Pamela Dunham. Because basically, Mollie, I think what she's getting at, and I think is a really important point, is that when we're talking about, I think one of the kind of undercurrents was that in these last 5 years, people just like absolutely lost their mind because of in the media, because they hated Trump with such a fiery passion. And so they abandoned this pretense of journalism. And obviously, as you talk about in your book, there were some things that Donald Trump did as in the past, like after the election, which weren't helpful. And there were some of his advisors and Rudy Giuliani who did not put their best foot forward and make the case any easier. And so I think that there's almost become, and especially post January 6th, there's now this, it can all just be brushed away as like, you know, this, oh, it's just Trump and his craziness. So is there a way that you think we can kind of put Trump over here and like 2020 election in like what happened and decouple it from the baggage of Trump?
So yes and no. I mean, for me, one of the things that was interesting was about the other book that I wrote with Carrie Severino about the Kavanaugh confirmation. I think a lot of people want to believe that horrible treatment of Trump was because of who Trump was, when in reality, the corrupt media will do this against even men as decent as Brett Kavanaugh, you know, men with stellar reputations for loyalty and fidelity and faithfulness, you know, in their personal relationships. And that was a big wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people, realizing that that this is something that is really the corrupt media's problem as opposed to a particular individual's problem. Now, I have a lot of criticism to go around in the book about, you know, one of the things that was kind of frustrating for me as I was reporting it and interviewing people, and I interviewed President Trump, I interviewed former Attorney General Bill Barr, had really great chats with both of them. They both knew what was going to happen, and neither of them, in my view, did enough to stop what was going to happen. Then after the election, it is absolutely true that Trump allowed the worst legal arguments to go forward, said the best, and there were really good arguments that should have gone forward. And I know it's frustrating that the courts weren't handling it properly. But at the same time, I'm kind of frustrated that more people weren't assisting with that effort. Like, at what point does it have to be just Donald Trump taking care of these things? Why isn't the rest of the architecture also providing more support? So I think there's like a lot of blame to go around, but I don't know, you know, it's just, life is what it is. This is the guy who is president. He's also the person who's responsible for so much of the success that the movement had, much to my surprise, actually, and much to a lot of people's surprise. Yeah. And I think that like, you need to admit that, you know, you need to admit the good things he did, particularly if you want to talk about the problems that he had or the ways he makes things more difficult. And also, I think you need to be realistic about how, unfortunately, too few people on the right are learning the proper lessons. So I was just thinking about this because I love following what Ron DeSantis is doing, governor of Florida. And I'm wondering, why isn't there like a competition between competent governors to be like, who can be the best at leading us out of this bad situation we're in? Why does it all have to be him? Like, why aren't more people, why isn't everybody in the Senate who has a brain punching back against some of this insanity? And so I think there's a lot of frustration that because of like petty personal politics in the Republican Party or in the conservative movement, people aren't thinking about the big picture, which is, you know, we have a country to save here. Let's get all hands on deck and keep going. I don't even know if that answers it, but.
It does.
Okay.
Harry, did you want to go?
Yeah. So Mollie, I'm going to read there's another question from our friend, Grace Marie Turner. Grace, I'm glad you're here. So Grace Marie writes, Mollie, your book is incredibly well researched and thorough in exposing how many people and processes were engaged in the strategy to rig the election. Because it was so diffuse and they flooded the zone, how do we stop this from happening in 2022 and beyond?
So one of the things I'm working on in my journalism right now, I always worry that one of the things that happens on the right, the left has really invested a lot in taking over elections, and they have electoral victories to show for it. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of manpower. This was not something they dreamt up in 2016. It's been something they've been working on for a long time. And I think, frankly, people on the right should have been much more concerned about the integrity of elections before it was too difficult to ignore. And so I worry sometimes that what happens on the right is people look at whatever was done to them last and they fight that without realizing what's happening going forward. And so I just want to kind of share, for instance, one of the big things I researched in the book, and this was the part that made me just horrified. Like I didn't even expect to find this, was the private takeover of government election offices. Basically, they've had an army of left-wing activists come in and run Democrat get out the vote operations from inside. And they did it primarily in the blue areas of swing states. They targeted the funding in blue areas of swing states, and that's how they won. And remember that the election came down to like 43,000 votes across 3 states. So very narrow, even smaller than the 2016 victory for Trump. And they were moving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of votes. So this was a massive operation, very smart and well thought of. Now, what the team Biden is doing is they're actually asking federal agencies to kind of take over part of this operation. So now it's your taxpayer dollars being used through federal agencies to run Democrat get out the vote operations, at the federal level. This is something we need to be more aware of. I'm trying to do some journalism on this so we can kind of understand how they operate, who's in charge of it, which is Susan Rice, which is, a big, someone you wouldn't trust for voter integrity. And it's a very political operation, and it's being done with all the power and force and money of the federal government. And so it's a lot that needs to be done. But I would also say that we've also had some good opportunities to see how people are fighting back against some of this. And Virginia is actually a great example where people started being like, we should care about how elections are being run. And you have all these like little voter integrity units who realize going on election day does not cut it, because election day is when basically Republicans vote. And it's not, and Democrats have already just spent months voting. And if you want to detect problems, remember what I said, you do it before the ballot is separated from the envelope. That means you need to be there at those offices for the months leading up to it. That requires a lot of staffing, coordination. And the good news is many states are building up that framework now.
Mollie, this is a good time to talk about Chapter 7, which was fascinating, how you figured out the connections with big tech. I think that most people think, well, the way in which, for instance, Twitter messed with the elections is kicking Trump off of the website, or kicking other people off the website, or as we saw with the New York Post, deplatforming them for a while when the Hunter laptop issue. So they think of these specific issues, but you reveal something even more terrifying, and that is how the money that Zuckerberg himself put into really rigging the election. So can you tell us a little bit about Chapter 7?
Yeah, is that the Zuckerberg should be in jail chapter?
Yes, which is hilarious. You just go right for it.
Yeah, no, I interviewed former President Trump like 3 times, and he said that in one of the interviews, and I was like, oh, that will make a good chapter title. But Mark Zuckerberg, who is, and he has this Zuckerberg Chan Global Initiative with his wife. They ended up giving close to $450 million to 2 far left-wing groups to assist with like COVID voting. So you're thinking, protective personal equipment for vote workers, which was like 1% of the funding. And then the other 99% went into everything required to help Democrats get their ballots to be counted. And so that could be different things in different states, because every state has different laws. One of the things I get into there is how in Wisconsin, the people who were employed by these Zuckerberg-funded groups, in some cases ended up completely taking over the operation and kicking out the duly qualified government workers. So this could mean everything from designing a ballot, translating a ballot, marketing to Democrat interest groups to make sure that they voted, curing ballots, which is something that really was an important legal issue that still needs to be worked out. Curing a ballot is when someone votes by mail, particularly for the first time, they usually completely mess it up. Think about it like if you were going to vote for the first time and they said, fill in the circle, and instead you just drew a big X through the names you hated. Or
This
something
is me.
like
This is me. You're speaking directly to me.
Your ballot would be hard to read, or might be rendered moot. So what they did is, in blue areas of swing states, they devoted people to helping blue voters make sure that their ballots would be counted. It meant hiring the people who were checking whether your signature was valid, which is a horrible way, by the way, to determine whether a ballot is real or not. And you wouldn't believe, I actually had some examples in the book of like what gets counted as a legitimate signature that's not in any way a legitimate signature. It could be about, purchasing the machines that count the ballots or that to handle signature verification. I mean, it's basically like every part of the process was funded by Mark Zuckerberg in blue areas. And the argument from the Zuckerberg people is, well, we funded both blue areas and red areas. And that's true, but like this, Philadelphia got $10 million. The Republican county next door got 5,000. Like, oh, well, there are more people in Philadelphia than the next county. By whatever measure you use, it was overwhelmingly financing the get out the vote operations in blue areas of swing states. They targeted one state in particular, Georgia, and Georgia's story should be ringing alarm bells everywhere. You take, just by way of example, Florida. Florida is a hotly contested state. Donald Trump barely won it in 2016 by like 1%. 2018, Ron DeSantis won and Rick Scott won, but they won by even smaller percentages. I think it was really narrow. It's a very tough, hard-fought state. They have pretty good election laws and processes because they put the country through what they put us through in 2000, if you recall. So in 2020, Donald Trump ends up winning by 3 points. So that's kind of like a good indication of that area. Right across the border in Georgia, not entirely dissimilar demographics. Georgia went 5 points for Trump in 2016, 1 point for Biden in 2020. It's like, what the heck happened there? Yeah. And what happened is 10% of the funding from Zuckerberg went to that state alone. And it mostly went to blue counties to completely just take over the election process and run Democrat get out the vote operations. Now, what's particularly alarming about Georgia, I think, for people who care about this, is in most states and municipalities where this was happening, people kind of knew what was going on. Like the Democrat mayor, the Democrat governor would be like, we could use your help here, and they'd bring the people in to do it. Georgia was a state that should have known better. And I go into the story why they didn't know better and why they messed up everything. Yeah. But it's something that it's unfair to the people of Georgia to treat people in one county differently than the rest, and to run this kind of operation from the government. So, lots on there.
Yeah. Mollie, Linda Trausch asks, Mollie, thank you for writing this book. Do you feel that any of the election officials who took Zuckerbucks and outsourced their election duties will be prosecuted? And I think really this question is, Trump says that Zuckerberg should be in jail for what he's done. But is this the kind of thing? Is there actual, were laws broken, or is this them gaming or working beyond a system that was, playing within the rules, but just kind of abusing it in
so it's
in magnitude or whatever?
It's a complicated question. It should have been deemed illegal before the election. Unfortunately, the lawsuits that were brought didn't have the information that we have now. So there were some lawsuits that were brought that said that we can't have this private funding of elections. And the judges who looked at it said, it doesn't appear to be partisan. Well, now we know it was completely partisan. It was done as if there's nothing they would have done differently if they were trying to have anything other than a partisan effect. So if the judges had known that, they might have deemed it illegal beforehand. There's also the issue of different states have different rules. I do think it violated Wisconsin law. Wisconsin, because of its progressive history, has really rigorous voter protections, and that includes protections against conspiracies like this. It includes protections so that you should not be compelled to vote, and they had rampant assaults on nursing homes in Wisconsin. So there are many ways that the Zuckerberg funding may have broken the law, and there just was a special counsel there, a former prestigious Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin, who says it should be looked into because it looks like they violated state law. Every state is different. There definitely was a conspiracy. And this is why I can't remember how many states have made it illegal thus far, but many states have made it illegal to do this private takeover. Of course, as I mentioned, the federal government is taking it over now, so that's a problem.
Yeah. You know, and before, if I can just interrupt real quick, we've got another question that kind of dives into that a little more. Lee Otis asks, you said the latest problem is that someone on the Democratic side is asking federal agencies to take over the running of elections. Or I think really you talked about like kind of having that role in the, you know, doing what the Zuck Box did. You know, who's asking, like, how are they asking, which agencies are involved? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
I wish I could talk about it in much greater detail, but I just started working on this story. So there was an executive order that Joe Biden put out to ask federal agencies to do some of this. It's very nebulous. We've put forward Freedom of Information Act requests, but we haven't gotten the information back, even though the executive order itself said that the agencies had to report what they were doing by a certain time, and that time has passed. So I'm digging into it right now, and I just wanted to share it because I think we need to remember that you don't just fight what happened, you look at what's happening going forward. We also know that Democrats tried to do a complete federal takeover of elections through legislation. They named it their #1 priority. They acted insane about it. In fact, they were saying that if you support voter ID, something that literally 80% of the country supports, and like the other 20% probably just haven't thought it through, that made you a racist. I mean, it's just insane how they were acting about it. They tried to do this complete takeover, knowing that if they do it, they can lock conservatives out of power forever. They didn't succeed, but they're going to keep trying. And so it's important. You know, I even worry about it heading into this next election. I think it's an existential issue for Democrats. They are like obsessed with wanting to be able to create opportunities for malfeasance that make it very suspicious. So I think everyone needs to be on guard. Everyone needs to be like focused in their own states. Again, this is not, I don't mean it just like right now, it's kind of a Republican Democrat issue, but it's really important for the whole country, for the preservation, to have good voter laws and processes that we can all trust, because trusting in the outcome of elections is really important for the Republic.
Well, I think we should call this breaking news that Mollie's got a new investigation going, which means a sequel is coming.
It'll be at the Federalist. It'll roll out.
Okay. All right. Lisa Schifrin, a friend of IWF, a fellow of ours, also, you know, Lisa, she asked a great question here. She said, do you believe that there were instances of actual ballot fraud in some swing states that could have swung the election? Okay.
So it's funny. When I started writing about it, it was so not what I write about that I kind of just thought of fraud as all the problems that can happen in an election, like problems with voter rolls or problems with, you know, like whatever the problem is, I always kind of put it as fraud. Fraud is actually a pretty narrow issue, and it requires not just, you know, a manipulation of the process, but with like knowing intent. So I actually write about in the book a big case of, you know, what's technically fraud, which is in Georgia, they found more than 10,000 voters who were illegally voting because they were registered in one county and then they voted, then they moved to another county, but they went and voted in the other county. So that is, that actually, it does meet the definition. It's a large number. It's actually larger than the number of the margin. They should have been taken seriously by the Secretary of State, but even when they admitted that it was happening, they were like, no big deal, more or less. So there are instances of not just fraud, which of course they're always there, but widespread fraud of that kind. You know, but again, I want to be technical. I want to make sure we're understanding what that means. Like those were probably real people who broke the law and thereby disenfranchised the law keepers in the state, you know, who knew that they had moved, and so they didn't go vote in their old county. So it's an important issue, but I don't think it's quite as sexy as some people think of when they think of fraud.
A bag of, you know, over the shoulder, and yeah.
Yeah, and then I also want to say the whole design of the system was to create opportunities for fraud with almost no way of catching it. So we don't really know how big of a problem it was. And in some states, they even make it like illegal to look into it. So it's like a whole mess. The whole system is a mess that alarms me. But I also just want to say the actual rigging was so much bigger than fraud. Fraud was just like this. The rigging is, you know, what's happening with our corrupt media, with the tech algorithms. We didn't even talk about this, how they suppress information that's harmful to the left, like in every way, in all algorithmic ways, and censorship. the changes to the laws and processes to enable this muddiness, the Zuckerberg funding, like all these things aren't, you know, what the media do to hurt our country is not fraud, but it probably affects millions upon millions of votes. So we need to not lose the forest for the trees.
Limit it to just specific fraud. Yes.
Yeah, you know, Molly, one other thing that that I found fascinating, and I hadn't really heard anybody else talk about until I read your book, was the treatment of potential third-party candidates. Because I think that those of us out here who know, you know, oh no, the Libertarian's going to be on a candidate that's going to take away 2 or 3% or whatever, and it's going to, but man, the Democrats really cracked down to make sure that there was effectively no third-party candidates. Can you talk a little bit about
media
that?
And other Democrats? Like, it was a whole conspiracy. And just think again back to 2016, the media and other Democrats believed that third-party candidates would help Hillary Clinton. So that's all we heard about. Do you remember that Evan McMuffin guy who was like supposedly some big deal? And
yeah,
I mean, and like they would just pump him up and pump him up. Well, then you had like legitimate third-party candidates like the Libertarian Party and Green Party. You didn't hear a word about them. There were no debates. There was no mention. It was like, in fact, the New York Times said like, we have got to make sure the third-party candidates like stay silent. There was a massive effort. And I just want to say real quick, because I forgot to mention it. The same guy who ran the Russia collusion hoax is this like shady election lawyer named Mark Elias.
Oh, yeah.
He also ran the 2020 effort to corrupt the election. So he's like a big Democrat lawyer. And I was like, how many horrible stories is this guy going to be involved in? It's all Mark Elias. But it was a major coordinated effort to keep third-party candidates off. And it was actually very disappointing to see how people who should have known better went along with it. And so I think I wrote about even like Kanye West, his people filed right at the last minute. They were having trouble like getting into the building because of COVID, and they were misled on where to go, but they get it in by the deadline. And then later they go, no, actually the deadline was 5 o'clock on the dot. And you came in like 5:0014. So that was after 5. So you are too late. I mean, ludicrous stuff. Or there would be Democrat allied groups claiming that people had to be thrown off the ballot because, you know, like technical violations, and the courts would go along with it. And they put most of their effort into Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And these are states that historically have huge numbers of people voting for the Green Party or Libertarian Party. And so by keeping them off the ballot, it saved like tens of thousands of votes. And that's important, again, in these elections with these tiny margins. Carrie, if you don't mind, there was one other thing I was going to mention, which I thought was shocking when I researched it. So I interviewed a bunch of Republican officials at the national and state level. And I was talking to Ronna McDaniel, and she mentioned this thing about how they'd just gotten out of this consent decree. And when she told me about it, I couldn't believe it was real. Like I just couldn't believe it was real. So for nearly 40 years, the Republican Party was unable by consent decree to participate in any election day oversight or litigation. It's crazy. I'm like,
it's jaw-dropping. That was a jaw-dropping.
I don't understand how Republicans won anything in the last 40 years. And they had gotten involved in something in a gubernatorial election in the early 80s. And this judge put them under consent decree. He was a super lefty judge. He actually retired. He kept them under, like they would do anything and it would trigger the re-upping of the consent decree. The guy retired but took senior status, which allowed him to keep, you know, certain cases, just so he could keep them under this consent decree. And it took the dude dying and being replaced by another lefty judge, but not like insane lefty, to get Republicans out from under it. And they almost were kept under it because like Vanity Fair had a story about how Sean Spicer was on like a certain floor of Trump Tower in 2016 on election night when he should have been on a different floor. And so the Democrats said, we got to keep them under this consent decree. But this new judge was like, are you kidding me? Stop. And finally let them out. But what that meant is that for 40 years, the legal operation of the Republican National Committee was not focused on helping deal with voter issues. It was focused on telling people basically not to do anything, not to do any oversight, not to report anything, not to get involved in anything. And so for 40 years nearly, Republicans had to do this with their arms tied behind their back. And it was just shocking to me. And I thought, there's no way this is real, because I would have heard about it. And I looked it up, and it was like, even when it was written about by media people, they would just act like it was a totally normal thing. And I'm like, this is insane.
Yeah, that is just kind of jaw-dropping, and it does make you think. Sometimes I feel like a lot of us get frustrated to think, why is the people we're rooting for so bad at some of this? But there actually is a reason why some of these institutions have been have had such trouble. You guys, I want to appreciate everybody who's in the audience. First, I've loved all the questions and poll participation. We're going to be wrapping up in just a minute. Remember, there is going to be a book giveaway at the end, so please stick around. And we have time for just one or two more questions here. And I'm going to, Mollie, just quickly throw this. Lynn Mantle has asked the question: has the Democratic Party become a subversive hate group in America? And that's kind of a tough question, but it's interesting in reading your book. I do think there was something where it does seem as though, especially under Donald Trump, that there was so much frustration and so much inability. You talked a little bit about the beginning about being able to see Trump for the good and the bad, and we've really tried hard at IWF to call balls and strikes. There's the President Trump did amazing things when it came to policy, but that doesn't mean that we agreed with every statement or action he ever took. But man, they lost their mind on it. So do you feel as though, how do you react?
It's interesting. I keep thinking about it because today we saw the news that Susan Collins, I think she's indicated she's going to vote for Ketanji Brown Jackson. Yeah. I've covered her for a really long time. I know she's actually pretty liberal, pretty moderate, we could say. But she's a pretty consistent, principled person. The Republican Party, it's interesting, has it's a pretty big tent. You have people who are super, Susan is a very principled person, just very moderate. And, people who are very conservative and very principled. And the Democrat Party has almost operates in lockstep with very few exceptions. Every once in a while you'll get like a Kirsten Sinema or Manchin departure, but that's it, right? They're all pretty united on a pretty crazy far left agenda. And you have, with the help of this corrupt media, they will say, oh, Joe Biden's a moderate. Joe Biden's a moderate. Like, are you kidding? Yeah. This doesn't even make any sense. He's like crazy out there. The people he's nominating are unimaginably lefties, and they're doing lefty things. And so I don't think the Democrat Party maybe even likes that they've been captured by their far left flank and that they're taking them over a cliff, but that's what the situation is right now. And so you have this interesting situation where you just have like this 80% of people in the country are under this like pretty big tent of normalcy, maybe, who are like, I don't know what's happening over there, and I don't like it. The problem is, though, what's happening over there, even if it's not representing much of the country, it's basically got complete control of the media. Yes. Complete control of academia, complete control of Hollywood. Many of the elites, like throughout the world, are part of this group that's not in line with where much of the country is. So I think there's still like a lot of room for diversity of thought over here, but it's just like we're getting harmed by these crazy people over here, and it's all the power.
And it also has control over a lot of these credentialing organizations, yes, like the medical associations, the pediatric associations. They are just getting more and more lefty. And this actually does it will affect you. You can say, well, I don't watch Hollywood films, and I don't watch the Academy Awards, and I don't really get involved. But these credentialing organizations are very important for the average American who goes to the doctor or sees your pediatrician.
I do think people should have confidence in just being people who don't like what they're seeing, and just, how much longer do you want to stay quiet about it? There are all sorts of things we can do, talking to our neighbors, talking to people. It's a very fraught situation. So there's really no option other than to raise your family well, or, talk to your family members, your nearest neighbors, and encourage those people who are supposed to be leaders to be demonstrating much greater courage and much greater fight. Like even these issues with being, what does it mean to be a woman, and the confusion that you're seeing on the left. This should not really be a political issue. It should not be this divisive of an issue. It's a huge opportunity for people who are normal to punch back, and people should be doing that.
Yeah. Well, we've got, and before we close, I just want to, there's one kind of quick question, and I think this speaks to, like, you know, you did such amazing work with the Russiagate story, and there's frustration, I think, among a lot of us that that the wheels of justice turn awfully slowly, if they turn at all, when it comes to the left being held accountable. And Pamela Mule asks, is there anything you have found that Mark Elias can be prosecuted for? I know it's tough, but curious if you felt like he actually was breaking the law.
So, I mean, I think it's maybe better to say, you know, how to hold him accountable, because I'm not sure how easy it would be to find the things. You know, there's such levels of privilege associated with lawyers, but it is worth remembering that he was sanctioned by the Fifth Circuit for his for lying to the court. Basically, he presented something to them and then came back in a duplicitous way, and they did not like it. He appealed it, and he was slapped down. So he likes to present himself as like some uber fantastic attorney. He's really good at bragging about himself, but he is able to be fought. One of the people I met when I was reporting the book was this like 21-year-old kid who took on Mark Elias and a team of DC lawyers. And this was in Claudia Tenney's district. Mark Elias is known for kind of taking victories from the jaws of defeat by challenging election votes, all the things that he claims are threats to democracy, but he does on behalf of Democrats. And this kid in this district who just knew the district well was able to fight him effectively. That's another story I want to tell here pretty soon. As for Russiagate, though, it is worth remembering his partner was indicted for part of his role and for lying about part of his role. So I do think, you know, there's a chance, but it's hard. It would just be great.
Maybe Elias and Zuckerberg can share a jail cell someday. That'd be nice.
I need someone else who thinks that would be a good idea.
Well, gosh, well, guys, Mollie, first I want to, on behalf of everybody, I want to thank you for not only for doing this with us today, but for really all your work. You are absolutely such an important figure in for our country, really, not just for the conservative movement, but in standing up and making sure the truth is known. So we're proud to stand with you and look forward to whatever's coming next for you.
Thank you. So, thank you for all of your good work.
Well, thank you. Well, we'll say goodbye to you, and everybody else hang on, because I get to announce my the winners today. We've got 3 winners, Lynn Marie, Cynthia Shira, and Linda Trausch. You will all be receiving a copy of the book. That'll be coming in the mail for you. And for everybody else, I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's, this month's IWF Reads Book Club. We hope you enjoyed the book and our discussion. If you have feedback, please send us a note in our Facebook group or shoot us an email at info@iwf.org. We'd love to hear from you. And from looking at our guest list, we have a lot of new names joining us. So I want to take just a couple seconds and introduce you to IWF. IWF is the leading national women's organization dedicated to developing and advancing policies that enhance freedom, choices, and well-being. We testify before Congress and state legislature, produce educational materials, and publish articles about various policy issues. We file legal briefs. We interface with the media. We also make a point to champion women. If you haven't read our Champion Women profiles, I'll hope you check them out. You can look at our iwf.org and see them in the About tab. We'd love to have you more involved with IWF, so please visit our website at iwf.org and sign up to receive the latest news and updates and events. My colleagues just shared the link to sign up, actually, so please also be sure to follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And in addition, if you haven't heard about our new online membership community, it's called Independent Women's Network. We recently launched IWN as a secure platform for honest conversations about politics and culture and family and education. And our members are really getting active and leading some of the fights against harmful policies. So please come and join us. You can sign up at a free level and get a taste of what we have at IWN. And please, come and visit us there. With that, it's time to say goodbye. Thanks again for joining us today. And please come back and visit us at Independent Women's Forum.